For months, fans were told women's basketball was entering a new era. Bigger audiences, bigger stars, bigger leverage. Every headline pointed in the same direction. Growth was finally here, and this time it was undeniable. But behind the scenes, something very different was happening. Not a scandal, not a lawsuit, just numbers quietly rolling in and refusing to cooperate. Because when the dust settled, one uncomfortable truth became impossible to ignore. The audience didn't just dip. It vanished. And once that happened, everything the players thought they had leverage, momentum, bargaining power started slipping away at the exact same time. What makes this story different isn't just how fast it unfolded. It's how confidently everyone claimed this outcome was impossible. And yet, here we are. Because the moment the numbers came out, the entire strategy collapsed in real time. And it all starts with one statistic that changed the tone of every negotiation overnight. When Unrivaled launched its second season, expectations were clear. This was supposed to be the proof of concept, the moment that silenced critics. The data point that showed women's basketball could thrive independently, without relying on legacy support or goodwill. Opening night was meant to send a message. Instead, it sent a warning. Season 2 debuted to roughly 107,000 viewers. That number, on its own, might not sound catastrophic until you compare it to the year before. The previous season opened closer to 313,000. That's not a soft decline. That's not seasonal fluctuation. That's a 65% collapse in a single year. And this wasn't buried on a streaming platform nobody tracks. This was on a major network, backed by heavy promotion, strong media coverage, and months of hype telling audiences they were about to witness something special. But the audience didn't show up. That's the part nobody expected. Because the narrative said interest was growing. The headlines said momentum was building. Analysts insisted this was a movement, not a moment. Yet when the lights turned on, the seats stayed empty, metaphorically and literally. What makes this drop so damaging isn't just the size. It's the timing. This happened during a critical bargaining window, when players were publicly signaling strength, when strike talk was loud, when confidence was high. And suddenly, the very league that was supposed to strengthen their hand did the opposite. Because ratings don't just reflect popularity. They determine credibility. And once those numbers became public, the conversation changed. Quietly at first, then all at once. But the real damage wasn't the decline itself. It was what that decline revealed about why Unrivaled existed in the first place, and how fragile the entire plan actually was. Because this league was never just about basketball. On the surface, Unrivaled was marketed as opportunity, a fresh start, a bold alternative, a league designed to empower players, reward talent, and finally give women's basketball the respect it had supposedly earned. That's the version that made headlines. That's the version fans were meant to believe. But beneath that framing sat a much more strategic objective, one that had very little to do with competition on the court. Unrivaled wasn't created to replace the WNBA. It wasn't even designed to compete with it long-term. It was built as leverage, a pressure point, a fallback option that players could point to during negotiations and say, if you won't meet our demands, we have somewhere else to go. That distinction matters, because leverage only works if the alternative is real. In labor negotiations, the threat doesn't need to be executed. It just needs to be believable. Employers don't cave because workers strike. They cave because they might strike and survive without them. That's what Unrivaled was supposed to represent. Survival outside the existing system. For a brief moment, it worked. At least rhetorically. Players spoke openly about standing firm. About refusing to settle. About demanding a share of revenue that reflected their value, not historical losses. Media echoed those talking points. Analysts framed the situation as overdue correction. The implication was clear. The balance of power had shifted. But there was one massive assumption holding everything together. That Unrivaled would prove there was independent demand. That fans would show up regardless of branding. That stars would carry audiences across platforms. That interest was transferable, not isolated. And that's where the strategy quietly began to crack. Because the moment Unrivaled's numbers came in, the fallback option stopped looking like a safety net and started looking like a liability. Instead of proving that players could thrive elsewhere, it suggested they might struggle even more without institutional support. And that changes everything. When executives sit across the table, they don't argue with passion. They don't negotiate based on belief. They look at data. They look at risk. They look at what happens if talks collapse. And Unrivaled's performance answered that question far more clearly than anyone expected. If this was the backup plan, it wasn't strong enough to scare anyone. Which explains why, almost immediately after those numbers became unavoidable, the public tone began to soften. The language shifted. The certainty faded. And the once confident threat of walking away started to sound less like strategy and more like a bluff that had been called. But the most damaging part wasn't the ratings themselves. It was what those ratings revealed about the broader ecosystem, and how dependent it really was on a single variable. Because as Unrivaled struggled to hold attention, another realization crept in, one that people inside the league had suspected for years, but never wanted to say out loud. Interest hadn't expanded. It had concentrated, and that concentration was about to erase the illusion of leverage entirely. Because once leverage disappears, demands don't get negotiated, they get ignored. Leverage is one of those words that gets thrown around constantly, but very few people stop to explain what it actually means. In theory, leverage sounds simple. You want something, the other side wants something, and whoever can afford to walk away has the power. But in reality, leverage isn't about who speaks the loudest or makes the boldest public statements. It's about who can absorb the consequences when talks break down. For months, WNBA players spoke as if that balance had shifted in their favor. The language was confident, sometimes defiant. There was talk of solidarity, of standing firm, of refusing to accept deals that didn't reflect their true value. Strike deadlines were floated. Lines were drawn in the sand. From the outside, it looked like a united front preparing to force change. But leverage doesn't come from confidence. It comes from options. And Unrivaled was supposed to be that option. As long as there was a believable alternative, the threat of walking away carried weight. Owners had to consider the possibility that players could leave, take fans with them, and build something sustainable elsewhere. That risk alone would be enough to soften positions, increase offers, and accelerate compromise. Except the alternative didn't hold. When Unrivaled's audience collapsed, it didn't just hurt that league's credibility. It exposed the underlying weakness of the entire bargaining position. Because if players couldn't draw viewers with full control, heavy promotion, and concentrated star power, then the threat of independence suddenly looked hollow. That's when the illusion broke. Behind closed doors, executives weren't panicking. They weren't scrambling to salvage negotiations. If anything, the pressure flipped directions. Because now the risk of a strike no longer looked catastrophic. It looked manageable, replaceable, maybe even beneficial in the short term. This is where public messaging and private reality diverged sharply. While players continued to speak about unity, the math was quietly working against them. Every disappointing rating weakened the argument that demand was being suppressed. Every underperforming broadcast suggested that interest wasn't being denied. It simply wasn't there at the scale being claimed. And once that realization settles in, leverage evaporates fast. Because from a business perspective, there's a difference between a partner making demands and a dependent making requests. One negotiates. The other waits. And after the numbers came in, it became clear which category the players now occupied. That's why the tone shifted so suddenly. The talk of bold action faded. Deadlines slipped. The urgency disappeared. What was once framed as a fight for fairness quietly became a discussion about practicality, about timing, about keeping things moving. And then came the moment that confirmed everything. After months of dismissing the existing deal as unacceptable, even insulting, players began floating the idea of continuing under the old agreement. The very framework they claimed they couldn't survive under was suddenly back on the table. That doesn't happen when leverage is strong. It happens when the cost of escalation becomes too high. Because striking without leverage isn't a show of strength. It's a gamble. And gambling only works when the odds are in your favor. At this point, they weren't even close. What looked like unity on the surface was actually hesitation underneath. What sounded like resolve was really recalibration. And the fallback plan that was supposed to empower players ended up boxing them in. But the real consequences of this shift weren't just symbolic. They were structural. Because once players began signaling a willingness to play under the old terms, they handed ownership something far more valuable than silence. They handed them time. And time, in negotiations like this, is power. Because when one side stops pushing, the other side stops rushing. The most revealing moments in negotiations rarely happen during press conferences. They happen in the subtle changes, the softened language, the delayed timelines, the sudden openness to options that were once dismissed outright. And that's exactly what began to surface once the leverage narrative started to unravel. For months, the message was clear and uncompromising. The existing agreement wasn't good enough. The pay structure was framed as outdated. The revenue split was described as unfair. Playing under those terms again was portrayed as something that simply couldn't happen. The implication was that accepting the status quo would signal weakness, not pragmatism. And then, almost overnight, that certainty faded. As the bargaining deadline approached, instead of escalation, there was hesitation. Instead of ultimatums, there were extensions. And instead of firm demands, there was a growing willingness to keep the season going under the same framework players had spent months criticizing. That shift didn't come from generosity. It came from reality. Once Unrivaled struggles became undeniable, the cost of confrontation rose sharply. A strike was no longer a powerful statement backed by a viable alternative. It was a risk that could expose how fragile the overall market actually was. Without proof of sustained demand elsewhere, walking away from guaranteed pay, even modest pay, suddenly looked reckless. This is where negotiation dynamics change completely. When one side signals that it's willing to continue under old terms, the other side gains breathing room. There's no urgency to compromise, no incentive to improve an offer, no reason to move faster than necessary. Because if operations can continue without disruption, pressure disappears. And pressure is the engine of change. By floating the idea of playing under the old agreement, players effectively removed the most powerful tool they had left. Even the threat of a sudden strike lost credibility, because threats mean less when both sides know who stands to lose more. From the league's perspective, this was confirmation. It confirmed that the players' bottom line wasn't leverage or principle, it was stability, consistent income, predictability. And once that becomes clear, negotiations stop being about fairness and start being about tolerance. How long can each side wait? In this case, the answer was obvious. The league had already survived decades of losses. It had weathered low attendance, modest ratings, and public skepticism for years. Players, on the other hand, faced much shorter timelines. Careers are limited. Windows close fast. Missing seasons doesn't just cost money, it costs relevance. And relevance, once lost, is hard to regain. That's why the idea of continuing under the old terms gained traction so quickly. It wasn't about satisfaction. It was about damage control, about preventing momentum from turning into decline, about avoiding a public showdown that the numbers suggested they might not win. But this decision carried consequences far beyond one season. By showing a willingness to accept the old framework, players weakened future negotiations before they even began. It signaled that earlier demands weren't firm boundaries, they were opening positions. And once that perception sets in, it's nearly impossible to reverse. Owners remember moments like this. They file them away. They reference them years later when similar conversations resurface. Because negotiations aren't isolated events. They're part of a long memory. And this moment will be remembered as the point where confidence gave way to concession. But the deeper issue wasn't just about contracts or timing. It was about math. Because even if the league wanted to meet every demand, the financial reality made those demands nearly impossible to justify. And once the revenue conversation entered the spotlight, the entire argument shifted from emotion to arithmetic. And numbers are far less forgiving than narratives. At the center of every negotiation, beneath the slogans and statements, sits one unavoidable question. Where does the money actually come from? It's an uncomfortable question because it strips away intention and replaces it with arithmetic. And arithmetic doesn't care how hard you worked, how passionate you are, or how loudly your supporters speak online. This is the point where the conversation stopped being about respect and started being about survival. Players pushed for a share of gross revenue, not net. That distinction is crucial, and it's one that often gets glossed over in public discussions because it sounds technical. But the difference between gross and net is the difference between sustainability and guaranteed losses. Gross revenue is the total amount brought in before a single expense is paid. Net revenue is what remains after costs like travel, staffing, marketing, production, facilities, insurance, and administration are covered. Every successful league in the world understands this distinction because it's the line between growth and collapse. The offer on the table reflected that reality. A proposed split of net revenue acknowledges risk on both sides. If the league grows, players benefit. If the league struggles, losses are shared. It aligns incentives. It rewards success without promising money that doesn't exist. But that wasn't enough. The demand for a percentage of gross revenue ignored the league's financial history entirely. This wasn't a league swimming in profit. It was one that had lost money consistently for decades, kept afloat by external support and long-term patience rather than organic demand. Under the proposed gross split, the league wouldn't just struggle, it would hemorrhage. Projections showed losses ballooning into territory that no rational business could justify. Not short-term red ink. Structural, compounding losses with no clear path out. And here's where the argument quietly fell apart. Players had originally asked for higher salaries, even seven-figure contracts. That was framed as ambition, as belief in the future. And when offers began to move closer to those numbers, something unexpected happened. They weren't accepted, because the issue was no longer about pay. It was about validation. Accepting a deal tied to net revenue would mean acknowledging the league's actual market position. It would mean admitting that growth hadn't yet matched the rhetoric. That demand was still developing, that the ceiling might be lower than expected. Gross revenue demands avoided that admission. They locked in rewards regardless of performance. They transferred all risk upward and left ownership holding the bill. From a negotiation standpoint, that's not a compromise. It's a non-starter. And once that became clear, talk stalled. Executives weren't offended. They weren't shocked. They simply ran the numbers and saw an outcome that made no sense. No investor, no owner, no partner could sign off on a structure that guaranteed deeper losses every single year. That's when patience replaced urgency. Because if the choice is between delaying agreement or locking in financial failure, delay becomes the responsible option. And once players began signaling they were willing to play under the old terms, that choice became even easier. The irony is that the math didn't just undermine the league's position. It reframed the entire narrative. For years, fans were told the problem wasn't demand, it was exposure. That interest existed but wasn't being monetized properly. That with the right promotion, the right platform, and the right push, the numbers would explode. But when given a platform, promotion, and full control through Unrivaled, the audience shrank. And that made the revenue argument impossible to ignore. Because revenue doesn't lie. It doesn't respond to hope. It responds to attention. And attention, as the numbers showed, was far more limited than the conversation suggested. At that point, negotiations weren't about meeting demands. They were about confronting a ceiling. And once that ceiling came into view, the idea that every player represented equal economic value became harder to defend, which led directly into the most uncomfortable realization of all, that the league's visibility wasn't broad. It was concentrated, and concentration changes everything. For years, the conversation around women's basketball leaned on a powerful assumption, that star power was spreading, that new names were emerging. That interest wasn't concentrated anymore, but distributed across a growing roster of recognizable faces. This belief became the backbone of the growth narrative. If the stars were multiplying, the audience would follow. But the numbers told a different story. What Unrivaled revealed, unintentionally, was that visibility in women's basketball isn't broad. It's narrow, highly concentrated, and far more fragile than anyone wanted to admit. Because when audiences tuned out, they didn't do so gradually. They didn't migrate from one player to another. They didn't linger out of curiosity. They left entirely. And that kind of behavior doesn't happen in a league overflowing with must-watch personalities. It happens when attention is tied to one or two gravitational forces. This is where the Caitlin Clark factor becomes impossible to ignore, not as a criticism of other players, but as a reality of market behavior. When she's on the screen, ratings spike. When she's not, interest drops sharply. That pattern repeated itself across platforms, time slots, and competitions. And that's not an indictment of talent. It's a reflection of consumer choice. Fans don't watch because athletes are good. They watch because they're invested, because they recognize the story, because they feel compelled to show up. And that kind of pull is rare. It can't be manufactured through marketing alone. The problem Unrivaled exposed was that media hype doesn't automatically translate into attention. You can promote a player relentlessly. You can declare them the next face of the league. You can repeat the message across every outlet. But if fans don't respond, the declaration doesn't become reality. It becomes noise. And this is where the idea of star equality quietly collapsed. Because if star power were evenly distributed, losing one name wouldn't gut an entire product. Viewership would soften, not crater. Interest would shift, not disappear. But that's not what happened. Instead, Unrivaled's audience fell to levels comparable to niche sports broadcasts, respectable in isolation, but devastating when framed as proof of a mainstream breakthrough. Especially given the salaries, promotion, and expectations attached to the league. This forced an uncomfortable reassessment. If viewership can't be sustained without one specific figure, then the ecosystem isn't growing. It's leaning. And leaning systems don't support sweeping demands. They support targeted investment. That's why the star conversation matters so much in negotiations. Because leagues don't pay for talent in the abstract. They pay for impact. They pay for attention. They pay for the ability to bring people to the screen, the arena, or the platform. And when that ability is unevenly distributed, compensation debates become far more complicated. This isn't about diminishing anyone's skill. It's about recognizing that markets reward differentiation, not equality. They respond to pull, not potential. And once that reality became visible, the argument that every player deserved a piece of a rapidly expanding pie became harder to sustain. Because the pie wasn't expanding. It was being held together by a single slice. And when that slice wasn't present, the entire structure weakened. Not slowly. Immediately. This realization didn't just affect how fans viewed the league. It reshaped how executives, investors, and partners assessed risk. Because building a business around one irreplaceable figure is dangerous. But pretending that figure doesn't matter is even worse. And that's why patience began to wear thin at the highest levels. Not because expectations were cruel, but because they were misaligned. And when expectations don't match reality, support eventually runs out. For decades, the WNBA has benefited from something most leagues never receive: time. Not because it earned endless demand, but because it was supported by an institution strong enough to absorb losses without immediate consequence. That institutional backing changed the rules. It allowed the league to survive conditions that would have ended almost any other sports venture long ago. But survival and independence are not the same thing. The NBA's involvement has always been framed as partnership, as shared values, as a long-term vision rooted in growth and opportunity. And to an extent, that framing was genuine. The league invested resources, promotion, infrastructure, and credibility into a product that needed all four. What often went unspoken was the expectation attached to that support. Patience is not unconditional. It's an investment with milestones. For years, those milestones were generous. Modest growth was celebrated. Small increases in visibility were treated as breakthroughs. The bar was set low because the belief was that momentum would eventually compound. That belief is now being tested. Because patience wears thin when alternatives fail. Unrivaled wasn't just an experiment, it was a signal. It was supposed to demonstrate that the audience existed beyond subsidies and legacy ties. That demand had matured enough to stand on its own. When that signal failed, it didn't just weaken one league's credibility. It raised questions about the entire ecosystem. From the NBA's perspective, this changes the calculation. Support only makes sense if it moves the needle over time. If each investment builds toward sustainability. But when ratings stagnate, negotiations stall, and public narratives grow disconnected from reality, support starts to feel less like strategy and more like obligation. And obligations get reviewed. This is where investor fatigue enters the conversation. Not as anger, not as resentment, but as reassessment. At some point, decision-makers ask whether continued funding is advancing the mission or simply maintaining the status quo. That's a dangerous moment for any league. Because when a benefactor stops seeing progress, generosity turns into scrutiny. Every expense gets questioned. Every concession gets reconsidered. And every demand gets weighed against what the market has actually proven. The league's longevity, once seen as proof of resilience, now carries a different implication. 30 years of existence doesn't automatically equal success, especially when losses remain consistent and breakthroughs remain elusive. That doesn't mean collapse is imminent, but it does mean tolerance is shrinking. And when players push negotiations as if that tolerance is limitless, they misread the room. Because leverage doesn't exist when your counterpart knows they can outlast you, especially when they're the ones subsidizing the system in the first place. This is why the fallback options mattered so much. If Unrivaled had worked, it would have forced difficult decisions. It would have created competition. It would have pressured the NBA to respond. Instead, it reinforced the idea that there is no alternative market at scale. And that realization doesn't empower demands. It restrains them. Because when one side knows the other has nowhere else to go, compromise stops being urgent. The clock stops favoring the louder voice. It favors the one who can wait. And in this case, the NBA can wait far longer than any individual player ever could. That imbalance is what defines the current moment. Not hostility, not disrespect, just arithmetic, of money, of time, of attention. Which brings us to the final question. Not about what happened, but what happens next. Because the path forward is narrowing. And every option carries consequences that can't be spun away. For a long time, two very different stories have existed side by side. One was loud, polished, and constantly reinforced. The other was quiet, numerical, and largely ignored. As long as those two stories didn't collide, the illusion could survive. But what happened with Unrivaled forced them into the same room, and only one walked out intact. The narrative said growth was inevitable. The market asked for proof. The narrative said new stars were everywhere. The market focused its attention on one. The narrative said interest was being suppressed. The market responded when given full freedom, and then walked away. This is the danger of confusing coverage with demand. Media presence can amplify interest, but it can't manufacture it. Promotion can introduce a product, but it can't force loyalty. At some point, the audience decides for itself. And when it does, that decision shows up in the only place that actually matters, behavior. Unrivaled wasn't sabotaged. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't ignored by platforms. It was given a chance that most startups never get. Prime placement, heavy promotion, familiar names, a clean narrative about empowerment and progress. And still, the audience shrank. That's not bad luck. That's information. It tells us that interest in women's basketball isn't evenly spread across the product. It's selective, conditional, focused, and far more sensitive to star presence than public conversations ever admitted. This is where the disconnect became impossible to maintain. Because if demand were truly broad, ratings wouldn't collapse when one variable changed. They'd stabilize. They'd redistribute. They'd soften, not fall off a cliff. What happened instead exposed a fragile attention economy built around moments rather than habits. And habits are what sustain leagues. This matters because negotiations, salaries, and long-term planning don't run on optimism. They run on repeat behavior. On audiences that return even when the novelty fades. On fans who show up without being reminded why they should care. Unrivaled tested that assumption and failed. Not because the athletes weren't skilled. Not because the product wasn't polished. But because the pull wasn't strong enough. That's the part that's hardest to accept, because it forces a recalibration. It means growth can't be assumed. It has to be earned slowly, deliberately, and honestly. It means compensation debates have to reflect current reality, not future hopes. And most importantly, it means leverage can't be built on narratives alone. Once the market contradicts the message loses power. That's why everything shifted so quickly after the numbers came out. Why confidence softened. Why timelines stretched. Why old agreements suddenly didn't seem so unacceptable anymore. It wasn't panic, it was recognition. Recognition that the story being told publicly had outrun what the audience was willing to support privately. And when that gap appears, systems correct themselves. Not out of malice. Out of necessity. This is the moment where industries either adapt or stall. Where expectations either reset or collide with reality again. And where future decisions are made with a lot more caution than conviction. Because now, everyone involved knows the same thing. The market has spoken, not once, but repeatedly. And pretending it didn't isn't an option anymore. At this point, there are no mystery outcomes left. The paths forward are visible, and none of them align with the confidence that once dominated the conversation. That's the quiet irony of this moment. After all the headlines, all the bold statements, all the talk of leverage and transformation, the future has narrowed instead of expanded. One option is acceptance. Players continue under something close to the existing agreement, with minor adjustments framed as progress. The season moves forward. Games are played. Paychecks arrive. Public messaging shifts from confrontation to optimism. Stability replaces ambition, at least temporarily. That option preserves income, but it also locks in reality. It confirms that the leverage moment has passed. That earlier demands weren't pressure points, but opening bids. And once that precedent is set, future negotiations begin from a weaker position, not a stronger one. Another option is escalation. A strike, a standoff, a public test of resolve. This path carries symbolism, but symbolism doesn't pay salaries. Without a proven alternative, a strike doesn't force change. It invites replacement, delay, and indifference. History shows that walkouts only succeed when absence creates pain. And right now, the numbers suggest absence would barely register. Then there's the slow fade. No dramatic showdown. No official collapse. Just a gradual recalibration of expectations. Fewer promises. Softer language. Growth reframed as long-term. This is often how systems retreat without admitting defeat. Not with an announcement, but with silence. What's striking is that none of these outcomes reflect the narrative that dominated just months ago. The story was supposed to be upward. The leverage was supposed to be real. The momentum was supposed to be irreversible. Instead, the market spoke. And markets don't respond to belief. They respond to behavior. They respond to what people watch, not what they're told to value. They respond to attention, not intention. And when the opportunity came to prove demand independently, the response was decisive. That doesn't mean women's basketball disappears. It doesn't mean players lose relevance. It means the ceiling has been revealed, and ceilings change strategy. The biggest mistake made wasn't ambition. It was assumption. The assumption that interest was evenly distributed. The assumption that hype equaled loyalty. The assumption that one breakout moment meant universal demand. Unrivaled didn't just struggle. It clarified. It showed where attention actually concentrates. It showed what happens when promotion outpaces pull. It showed how quickly leverage evaporates when alternatives fail. And now the system is correcting. Not emotionally. Not politically. Economically. That correction doesn't care about narratives. It doesn't care about headlines. It doesn't care about what should be true. It only reflects what is. Which is why this moment matters more than any press release or talking point. Because once the illusion breaks, it doesn't come back. You can only adapt to what replaces it. So the real question isn't whether players should accept the old deal or push for more. The real question is whether the league, and the people surrounding it, are ready to align expectations with reality. Because eventually, every industry learns the same lesson. You're not worth what you believe you deserve. You're worth what people consistently show up for. And right now, the numbers are doing all the talking. If you want real analysis instead of recycled headlines, if you want numbers, incentives, and outcomes explained without spin, make sure you're subscribed. These conversations don't happen in mainstream coverage, but they do shape what happens next.